So this video lecture is going to be about the canon of invention. In rhetoric, we have what are called 5 canons or measures of a good argument. The first canon is invention. The second canon is arrangement. The third canon is style. The fourth canon is memory. And the fifth canon is delivery. And you can see from those 4 canons that rhetoric really begins in an oral discourse society, right? An oral discourse culture where people are going to be memorizing and delivering their speeches. But as we became more of a writing culture and less of a oral culture, the canons of rhetoric didn't become suddenly obsolete. In fact, we still learn a lot from these canons. For example, in order to write something, in order to argue, in order to entertain, in order to communicate, the first thing you have to do is come up with something to say. How do you do that? Like, for many novice writers, that's the biggest problem. Like, they don't even know where to start. How often have you sat there in front of a blank page, watching your little cursor blink and wondering, what do I write about? I don't even know what to say. I don't even know how to get started. Well, the canon of invention is designed to help us figure that out. How do we figure out what we want to write? How do I figure out how to start? How do I, in other words, invent an argument? Every thesis you will ever write, every argument you will ever make, the first step is finding something to say. And there are a few ways to go about trying to figure this out, like trying to invent an argument. That's what we're going to be talking about right now. So, theses. A thesis statement always, always, always starts with an answer to a question or a solution to a problem. That's literally what a thesis statement is. If you have a question you're investigating, if you have a problem you're trying to solve, think about your opinion on any topic or any issue. If you trace your opinion backwards, what you're going to find is there's some question about life or meaning or right and wrong that your opinion is an answer to. If, for example, you are pro-choice or pro-life on the topic of abortion, whatever position you take, if you're pro-gun or anti-gun, if you're for free speech or against free speech, if you trace that back, there are some questions that your opinion is trying to answer. It might be the question of, what does a woman do if she finds herself pregnant, she doesn't want to be pregnant? Or what does a person do if they want to defend themselves and their loved ones? Or how does somebody ethically declare their position on a particular topic? These questions then lead to positions. So anytime you have a question or a problem to solve, if you have an opinion on something, if you trace it back, you're going to find the question or the problem that the opinion is trying to solve. The question is, how do we develop these questions to begin with? How do I get to the point where I can actually take a position on something? This is where the canon of invention comes in handy. So when we're talking about invention, what we're looking at is what we call a heuristic. What you need is some pragmatic system that will help you solve the problem or answer the question in the absence of certainty. See, you don't need a heuristic. You don't need a way to figure out a problem or to discover an answer to a problem if you're already certain about it. Unless you're a flat earther, nobody's arguing about how to prove the earth is round anymore because, well, we kind of already know that it is and we take it for granted. Remember what I've said. I've said multiple times over the course of my discussions that what you need to be if you're going to investigate problems and you're going to get to a solution that's actually true, you have to be truth oriented in your inquiry. Now, if you don't care about the truth, if you're not ordered towards the truth, you don't really care. We have a term for that. I will not say that here, but we do have a term for that. I guess we can call it sophistry. I was going to say bullshit, but you know, I didn't want to curse, even though I just did. But we'll use the word sophistry. If you're not oriented toward the truth, you're engaging in sophistry. You care about winning. You don't care about telling the truth. But if what you want to do is figure out the truth, you have to be oriented toward the truth in your question asking. And you have to be willing to accept the truth when it comes. Now, that doesn't mean you just roll over and accept whatever somebody says. Oh, that was a good argument. I should just accept that. Like, that's not how truth-oriented inquiry works. There's still a challenge. There's still the agony of attempting to figure out what the truth is. But once clarity is discovered, you don't really need a process for figuring it out anymore. Once you know the truth, it's like, well, okay, that's just the truth. I don't need to deal with that very much anymore. And this is one of the problems that people who already know things have with a system or an approach like something like deconstruction. Because deconstruction is a method for questioning things that we even already know. We have these particular things already decided. So one of the problems that a lot of people have with critical theory in general is that critical theory approaches truth with a kind of knee-jerk skepticism. And if you want to have knee-jerk skepticism, you absolutely can. I mean, you can question everything. You can question very basic facts. Well, how do I know that rock exists? Well, how do I know I'm not living in a matrix or something? Like, it's absolutely possible. You can question anything. But if you're oriented toward the truth in your inquiry, once something is certain, you're going to be like, okay, we're going to build on that. This is the thing that's certain now. I'm going to use that as kind of the foundation, one of my foundation stones to continue building my, I don't know, temple of knowledge or whatever. Just because you know certain things, though, doesn't mean you know everything. And so you need a method of discovery. That's what heuristics are. Heuristics are these methodologies or these pragmatic systems for figuring things out when you don't know for certainty what's true. In rhetoric, heuristics are what we use to invent arguments. In other words, if you're going to engage with people, you have to find a way in. And heuristics can help you do that in an argument. In this video, I'm going to go over two heuristics that we use in rhetoric. One is called Stasis Theory, and the other one is called the Topics or the Topoi of Invention, the Commonplaces. All right, so let's start with Stasis Theory. Stasis Theory is a systematic heuristic that consists of a series of questions. They're categories of questions. A lot of times when people really start getting into stasis theory, they think that you have to go, well, first we're doing this, and then we're doing this, and then we're doing that, and then we're finally doing that. And that is one way to engage in stasis theory, but it's not the only way. So rather than thinking of these as maybe a scaffold or a ladder of questions, think of these as categories of questions. So stasis theory, the categories of questions that stasis theory encourages you to ask, begin with facts. How do we determine what's actually fact and distinguish it from opinion or assumption or presupposition or prejudice or interpretations or speculations? How do I distinguish between what's actually factual and all of this other stuff? The first stasis in stasis theory will help you do that. The second stasis in stasis theory is going to talk about the nature of the problem. How do I even define my terms? How do we define what kind of problem we're looking at? Is there a way to define it differently than the way that it has been defined? And what might that look like? The next stasis asks us to consider the significance of the different parts of the problem. So you could start with the significance of the problem itself. I mean, if you take a serious problem like abortion or gun rights or war, poverty, most people are going to find these to be significant questions, very important questions. And as we try to navigate the importance of a question, we want to break, or the importance of a problem, we want to break it down into its pieces. That's analysis, remember. And we want to try to see, well, are some parts of this more important than other parts of this? What parts of this are objectively important, and what parts of this are subjectively important? I mean, they might be important to some people, but not maybe to everybody. They might be important questions, but questions that deal more with personal taste or preference than they are stable aspects of reality, right? And then the last of the stases gives you questions to try to figure out how to solve the problem or how to answer the question. Each of these stases can be seen as a kind of jumping off point. In fact, the word stasis actually means a standing place or a place to stand on. If you think of each of these categories of questions in stasis theory as jumping off points, these are points of entry into a conversation, points of entry into an argument. And each one of them has a name, conveniently. We start with the stasis of conjecture, and then you have the stasis of definition, the stasis of quality or evaluation, and the stasis of jurisdiction or policy. Each one of these is a place or a means for discovering questions to ask so that you can get into a conversation. This is incredibly helpful, particularly if you are not 100% sure about everything in the topic that you're discussing, but most especially if you want to know the truth. Now, remember what I've said. I've said this lots of times. Argument is not, just because you have a really good argument doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusions you arrive at are true. But if you do have a reasonable argument, the likelihood that what you're getting at is true is higher than it is if you have an unreasonable argument. That's not cut and dry. That's a principle. That's not a rule. Okay? And I will use as an example of this the idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe. It wasn't until the 16th, 15th century and Copernicus that we realized the Earth was not the center of the universe. That is, under normal circumstances for that time period, that would have been an unreasonable thing to suggest, because all you got to do is go outside and look up at the stars at night and watch the heavens spin around the earth, cross around the earth, and the next night it's going to do it again. And it looks like this is happening. The earth is the center of the universe. That's a reasonable assumption to make. That's a reasonable conclusion, rather, to make just by looking at the sky. But it's an optical illusion, and we know that now. So a good argument, even one that's substantiated by solid evidence, does not necessarily mean that your conclusions are true. It's a good principle to follow. But you always have to be open to the possibility that even the most solid argument, the conclusions of the most solid, most reasonable argument, still might be untrue. And so you want to continually go back to the stases. You want to continually look at, okay, the stasis of conjecture. Is what I'm saying true or not? What are the facts here? How do I separate fact from assumption, from prejudice, from presupposition, from speculation? What is the nature of this problem? How are we defining our terms here? How important is this problem? How important are the components of this problem? What are the most important parts versus the least important parts? And who has the ability or the authority to make a decision in this respect? Who has the authority or the ability to come to a conclusion, to decide what we should do? So this is stasis theory. This is how stasis theory works. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to go through and talk about what each one of these stases does, okay? The stasis of conjecture, as I just said, what are the facts? Separating fact from opinion or from speculation. The stasis of definition, what is the nature of the problem? What do we call the problem? What do we call the parts of the problem? The stasis of quality, how important is the problem? And the stasis of jurisdiction or policy. How do we solve the problem? Who should solve the problem? Let's start with the stasis of conjecture. I want you to think about what that word conjecture means. So the word conjecture is often a synonym for speculation, right? So what we're doing in the stasis of conjecture is we're actually trying to distinguish between what's actually known, what are the facts, versus all of this other stuff. Some questions that you want to ask here, or some prompts that will help you ask the right questions. If this is an event, we want to know whether or not something actually happened. We want to know whether or not something actually exists, right? We might look at objectively verifiable facts, such as times, dates, places, statements that were said. Now, note that a statement, you can argue that a statement was said, even though the statement is untrue, right? And so the fact that something was said doesn't necessarily mean that what was said was true. This is the stasis of fact. I can say, well, Bobby said that he's a stock car racer. That might be a fact. It doesn't necessarily mean that Bobby's actually a stock car racer. He could be lying, right? What we're looking for here is objective, observable phenomenon. So if I'm doing this, if I'm interrogating or analyzing a particular opinion, and I am doing it through the stasis of conjecture, what I'm trying to do is distinguish what are the facts versus what's opinion, what's conjecture, what are the biases going on here, what are the prejudices, what are the interpretations. If you were trying to decide whether or not a person's gun rights should be limited in some way, how are you going to separate facts from conjecture? A lot of people argue that we should limit gun rights based on the fact that people get guns and they go and they shoot up schools. Okay, that is a fact, right? Like, people actually get guns and they go in and they shoot people in schools. That's a fact. but it's conjecture that should then lead to limiting gun rights. What are other facts that could be pulled into this? Well, you have to look at the fact that people have the right to bear arms. That's a guaranteed right in the Constitution. That is a fact. You may not like that, and you may argue at some point, well, I don't think that should be a constitutionally protected right. Okay, so how do we go about persuading somebody? Well, one of the ways people are trying to persuade people to regulate gun rights is by pointing to the violence, gun violence. And so they're pulling out these facts about gun violence in an attempt to limit or regulate gun rights. Well, how do the gun rights activists respond to that? Well, they go and they gather their own set of evidences. They will talk about the people who defend themselves using guns and people who are saved because somebody had a gun somewhere. They will refer repeatedly to the Second Amendment. They will, I don't know, talk about the myriad people who own guns and aren't going around killing people. So you have on both sides of an issue like this, a modern issue like this, one of the things that both sides are trying to do is appeal to fact, to objective fact. How do you use this as a jumping off point? So how would you use this stasis as a jumping off point to get into an argument? Well, here's a series of questions that you can use as a jumping off point. Is there a problem? Does the problem actually exist? Now, somebody could argue, well, how are you defining the word problem? We'll get to that in a second. But that illustrates that these stases aren't always facts, then definition, then quality, then policy. Rather, they are categories that you use as an in. You begin investigating in these categories and developing questions within these categories. So somebody can immediately argue, well, maybe I don't know, shooting up schools is not as big a problem as the media is making it out to be. That is a common talking point on the pro-gun side of this, the pro-Second Amendment side of this. But that's not this stasis, right? That would be the stasis of quality. So you can bounce back and forth between the stases. So again, while it's one way to think of stasis theory is to think of it as I'm going to look at the facts, then I'm going to try and define the problem, then I'm going to look at how important the problem is, then I'm going to try to figure out how to solve the problem. That's a perfectly valid way to use stasis theory. What I'm saying here is that it's not the only way to use stasis theory. Okay, that it's probably in your best interest to think of these as categories because you can enter into an argument from any of these jumping off points. The important thing is to think about how each of these jumping off points helps you develop questions to ask, probing, truth-oriented questions. Does a problem exist? Did something happen to create this problem? If so, what? What's the beginning of this issue? How did it start happening? Was there a change that occurred that caused this issue to become such a big issue? What caused it? Who caused it? Who was instrumental in creating this problem, if the problem exists at all? Who is the source of my facts? So once you start investigating facts, you start getting these facts. You have to ask, okay, are these facts reliable? Are they actually true, or are people just making stuff up? All of this is about dividing the objective, observable phenomenon, what can actually be said that is unquestionable, and comparing that to all of the stuff that tends to accumulate around those facts, speculation, um, uh, prejudices, the prejudices that cause us to read certain facts in certain ways, our biases, our presuppositions, any conjecture or speculation that we're making based on those facts, or any opinions that we arrive at based on those facts, any interpretations of those facts that are informed by our biases and presuppositions and prejudices. Okay, so that's what the stasis of conjecture is all about. The only way to correct error, the only way to correct falsehood is with the truth. And so this stasis, I'm spending a lot of time on this stasis, but it's partially because it's probably the most important stasis. And that's why it's listed first. It's the one that everything else comes from, right? You have to get the facts right. Now note that you can lie using facts. You don't have to tell a lie, or you don't have to make up facts in order to use them manipulatively. And so you have to be on the lookout for sophistry, for bullshit, anything that isn't oriented towards the truth. You have to be on the lookout for that all the time. That being said, don't become a knee-jerk skeptic, because that's the temptation. And there is something very, satisfying in being able to win an argument without actually taking a position at all, just asking questions and watching somebody else's position kind of dematerialize or decay, and you haven't really taken a position at all. Be aware of that too. You don't want to become a knee-jerk skeptic. That's its own kind of sophistry. Nicholas Shackle refers to it as the no position position. I often refer to it as the skeptic's trick, where you poke around until you find a hole in somebody's knowledge, and then you exploit that hole until this person doesn't know what's true. Be careful of that kind of stuff. Don't fall for those kinds of tricks. So what I've got here is a few examples of how to begin asking questions from the stasis of conjecture. I'm not going to go into these here, but I'm going to leave this up here long enough so that you yourself can take a look at these questions and kind of use them as jumping off points yourself. These questions are particularly important if you're analyzing something somebody's already said. So if you're looking at an opinion piece, or you're looking at a scholarly essay, or you're looking at a data set that's been presented to you, some argument that's been presented to you, these are some questions to ask to start sorting out facts from everything else. Okay, the actual facts from everything else. This list of questions is really important because stasis theory is not just a way to invent arguments yourself. It's also a way to invent counter arguments. And I'll get into that later in this slideshow. But just be aware that just because somebody presents a bunch of facts to you, or just because somebody presents a series of facts to substantiate a particular position, again, that doesn't necessarily mean the position is correct, and it doesn't even necessarily mean that the facts are correct. You want to go in and you want to make sure that the facts that are being presented are actually true. This happens a lot in scholarly essays. There is a tendency, there's a strategy rather, on the part of some scholars. And this is particularly true of activist scholars. So activist scholars are scholars who have an agenda. They're going in and they want to make sure that whatever they develop, it supports a particular, maybe a political or ideological or religious agenda, right? Activist scholars will often engage in this strategy where they put a crap ton of quotes or references. We often refer to it as reference bombing or quote bombing. It's the idea that if you look at their footnotes or their endnotes, there's so many sources. Source bombing is another term that's often used. There are so many sources there. Nobody's going to check those sources. And what that enables a scholar to do is it enables the scholar to make it look like all of these sources support this particular position or this particular interpretation that they're coming to, that they're trying to support in the body of their text. And they do it. I'm very reticent to accuse scholars of being disingenuous, and I'll have to create a video on this another time, but there is a problem. We call it the replication crisis. There's a lot of incentive in the academy to get published no matter what. And what occurs with that, what happens with that is a lot of scholars will then try to flatter the presuppositions of the editing boards in particular journals so that they can get published, so they can get the position that they want in the academy, like the tenure track position or the prestige or whatever. The replication crisis has demonstrated that a lot of what's been published in scholarly articles is crap. It's not true. It's not replicable. And there's high percentages of this. In some disciplines, it's upwards of 90% where they cannot replicate the published findings. In something like the humanities, you don't have to replicate anything. So in literature, in history, sometimes you don't often have to demonstrate the truthfulness of your position. Your position just has to be interesting. And this is a serious problem, in my personal opinion, in my professional opinion. This is a serious problem in something like history, where you're dealing with facts, but all of those facts are being interpreted. So what will end up happening is that if you source bomb, nobody's going to look at those sources, but it makes it look like your position is heavily supported by dozens of sources. But then if somebody actually goes in and investigates those sources, they'll find often those sources don't actually support the interpretation that's being presented, or they only tenuously support this interpretation, or these sources have been interpreted through a particular ideological lens that's not necessarily representing the sources adequately or even accurately. So this stasis of conjecture is so important to be able to differentiate between actual facts and anything else. And when you're reading sources, when you're reading opinion essays, when you're looking at speeches, the questions that I have here, these sample questions, these are not exhaustive, this list of questions, but they're designed to help you start thinking about the things you're being told. Okay? That's the purpose here. So I encourage you to freeze frame this, pause it, whatever you need to do. Look at these questions, read them at your leisure. Now I'm going to move on. All right, second stasis. So we've talked about the stasis of conjecture. That's all facts and whatever. Let's go into the stasis of definition. I would say that this is the second most important stasis. Um, think back to what I said about the problem. When we're talking about is there a problem, or has there been a problem, or what happened to start the problem, that's right here, right? That's in the stasis of conjecture. Remember that I asked that question of, well, how are we defining problem? How we define the problem, what we are willing, how we name the problem, what we are even willing to call a problem or feel the need to describe as a problem. This is all part of the stasis of definition. This is where we're trying to figure out what is the nature of the issue we're dealing with. What do we even call it? Once we decide to call something a problem, already we're dealing with the stasis of definition, because we are deciding that the nature of this particular issue is that it is a problem, and it's something then that needs to be solved. This is naming things in the world is a basic component of navigating the world. We are human beings. We are creatures of language. In his famous definition of man, American philosopher Kenneth Burke called man the symbol using animal. And he was very, very interested in this idea that human beings use language, we use symbols, but we're also used by symbols. So navigating the world absolutely requires this ability to define the world, to name the world, to give titles to things, and to be able to distinguish a thing from things that thing is not. You can see how this would have been extremely important long before the modern world. Our ancestors, however many hundreds of thousands of years ago, we started using language or something approximating language. We had to be able to differentiate not only for ourselves, but for other people, for other humans, for our companions, for our children, for our tribe mates. We needed to be able to distinguish things that would kill us from things that wouldn't kill us. People who were in our tribe from people who weren't in our tribe, or people who were in our group from people who weren't in our group. Day from night, the different seasons, and the things that told us that the seasons were changing. So designating what a thing is and distinguishing it from what it is not, that's one of the key elements of navigating the world. We have to be able to do that. And so that's why I think this is the second most important, and I think this is probably why it's considered the second stasis. Once you've got the facts down, you need to be able to differentiate fact from everything else, fact from not fact. But even in naming something a fact, you are doing something extremely fundamental and determining how do we decide what constitutes a fact versus speculation versus conjecture. And how do we name these things? How do we determine the words we're going to use to name each of these things? This we're going to call a fact. That we're going to call speculation. That we're going to call opinion. You are immediately giving the issue that you're discussing a nature, and you are distinguishing it from other things. There are a few common ways to do this, a few common strategies for defining things. We can define things by looking at what's similar to it. Note that earlier in this slideshow, in this lecture, I discuss speculation and conjecture. These are kind of synonymous terms. There are nuances there that allow us to differentiate between what speculation is and what conjecture is, but they're very similar. By looking at what something is and comparing it to something similar, something synonymous, that helps us to define a thing. We can look at the origin of the term. You want to be careful not to fall into what's called the etymological fallacy. And the etymological fallacy is when you make an argument based on an older version of the word, an older meaning of the word. But when we're trying to define something, one way to figure out what a word means or what a concept is trying to get at is to look at its etymology. Where did it come from? Another way to describe is description. So if we're trying to define a problem, we can describe the situation, and that can help us define the situation. And then the last is examples. You use concrete examples to help you define what's going on. I have here, these are taken from Corbett and Connor's book, Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student. And these are 3 definitions, 3 rules for figuring out the definitions of words, or for defining concepts, defining problems. First rule, definitions should be clearer and more familiar than the term being defined. If you're trying to describe the internet, for example, and you describe the internet as a toilet we've all been given straws to drink from, that's funny. I mean, that's interesting, but does it really help you understand what the internet does? Probably not. It would probably be more effective to describe the internet as a global system of interconnected computer networks that allows computers to communicate with each other, or human beings to communicate with each other through computers. That actually kind of explains what the internet is. The whole toilet analogy, while it may express somebody's attitude towards the internet, it doesn't really help you. It doesn't really describe what the internet does or what it's designed to do. So that's rule number 1. Definitions should be clearer and more familiar than the term being defined. Rule number 2, definitions should not repeat the term being defined nor use derivatives of it. This is a big problem that we're seeing, for example, in transgender debates. What is a woman? Well, a woman is whatever a woman feels like. It's the feeling of being a woman. That's a completely unhelpful definition. It doesn't actually clarify things. It doesn't define anything. So you do not want to use the word being defined or a derivative of the word being defined. Woman is womanness. You do not want to use a derivative of the word being defined in the definition of the term. It may be very interesting. It may be very creative. It may even help you capture the difficulty, or rather, it may illustrate the difficulty of defining the thing you're trying to define, but it doesn't actually define it. It's not a good definition. A strong definition should not use the word or derivatives of that word in the definition. And rule number 3, when possible, definitions should be stated positively and not negatively. So you want your definition to tell you what the thing is, not what the thing is not. If I were to try to define the concept of a liquid, it would not be a good definition to say, well, a liquid is something that is not solid and it's not a gas. That's completely unhelpful. That doesn't, telling me what the thing is not doesn't help me understand what the thing is. So if you want to enter into a conversation or enter into an argument from the stasis of definition, these are some questions that you need to start asking. So what exactly is the problem or the issue? What we mean by that is what kind, what is the nature of the problem or the issue? How do we name it? What do we call it? Are there other ways to name it or other things we can call it? Are there a variety of things that we can name it or call it? Does it have multiple natures? What are its pieces? So what are the different components that make up this problem? And how do we name each of those components? How are they related? And how do we name those relationships? Who or what is influencing our definition? Once we've accomplished our definitions, or once we're starting to analyze the definitions that we already have, who's influencing that? Maybe even who benefits from it being named this way and not that way? What cultural presuppositions or beliefs or ideological commitments are informing the naming of the things we're naming? So these are a few questions that you can ask to, to start jumping into a particular argument or a particular problem. Now, if you're reading somebody else's argument, and again, I'm not going to go through these questions piece by piece or one by one. I'm going to allow you to read these on your own. But these are questions that you can ask when you're not just dealing with a problem, but you're dealing with somebody else's solution to a problem. When you're looking at somebody else's argument and you're trying to analyze that using stasis theory, these are some questions that you can ask. I invite you to, pause the video here, read some of these questions to get a sense of how you might engage somebody else's argument using stasis theory, how you might engage in counter argument using stasis theory. Next, the third stasis is the stasis of quality or evaluation. Every review you will ever write, every judgment you will ever make that is a judgment of quality. Anytime you test something, you want to see how it works, or whether or not you're going to enjoy this particular experience, or whether or not this tastes good. All of these are arguments about quality. Anytime you're judging something's quality, you're actually already engaging with the stasis of quality. You're using that as your jump off point. You begin using the stasis of quality by looking at the problem or issue itself and trying to figure out how important it is, how significant it is. To some degree, that's always going to be a little bit subjective. Look at something again like the abortion debates. There are people on one side of that argument who argue that a woman's right to autonomy over her own body and to make decisions for her body is more important than the life of the unborn child. People on the other side of that argument assert no, a person's right or over their own bodily autonomy, a person's right to make decisions about their own body is not more important than the life of the unborn child. So to some degree, you're looking at something as profound as abortion really pivots on this idea of this stasis of quality. Who's right? How do we decide who is right about what is more important? That being said, not everything is subjective. Not all qualitative arguments are subjective. You have to figure out what's objective and what's subjective. Which of these are dealing with realities and which of them are dealing with preferences, right? Things that have widespread consequences versus things that have very limited consequences. If you're looking at any of these issues listed here, you're dealing with the stasis of quality. So you want to talk about what's right or what's wrong, propriety versus impropriety. Think about people's health. Whenever you're dealing with a value judgment, how much something is worth. Economic questions are usually going to be questions of quality. Um, Moral questions are often going to be questions of quality. Um, Questions of sanctity. I mean, when we're talking about quality, sanctity really is about what's the most important thing. And so the thing that is most significant, the thing that is most important, that's a question of quality. Here is a list of questions that will help you use the stasis of quality as a jumping off point to get into an argument. I'm not going to go over these one by one because this video is already getting long enough. I invite you at this point to pause the video, take a look at some of these. But these are questions you would ask just to jump into an argument. These are questions that will help you analyze somebody else's argument from the stasis of quality, that will help you evaluate the quality of someone else's argument. And these are going to be questions that are going to be really important if you want to engage in counter argument. So if you think that something is more important or less important and than what another person is presenting it as, these are some questions that will help you determine, how do I enter into this conversation? How do I counter argue from the stasis of quality? The last of the stases is the stasis of jurisdiction or policy. When we're talking about jurisdiction, what we're talking about is who gets to make the decisions, who should be involved in solving this problem. When we talk about policy, we're talking about whether or not what should be done, whether or not something should be done, and what should be done. Under most circumstances, if you're at the stasis of jurisdiction or policy, you've basically already decided all of that other stuff. You've decided how important it is. If you're at the stasis of policy, you're thinking something should be done about it, and therefore you've decided whether or not something is important enough to have something done about it. You've decided what to call it, and you've decided what the facts are, or at least the pertinent facts. So usually the stasis of jurisdiction and stasis of policy, this is almost the end game, right? This is the climax of basically all these other kinds of questions that you're asking. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go through all of that other stuff to use the stasis of jurisdiction or policy as a jumping off point. It just means that all of those other questions have usually been solved. If you have a policy, if you want to argue for this is what we should do, these are who is important, notice that somebody can jump back to one of the previous stases and disagree with you on policy by redefining terms or questioning your facts or questioning the importance of a policy. So once the policy is determined, or once you're at the policy stasis, it's always possible to engage with somebody from any of the other stases. But arguing for a solution, you're in from the stasis of jurisdiction. If you're leaping off from this point, these are some of the things that you want to take into consideration. Who has authority? Who are the stakeholders? What are possible solutions? What's actually possible here if we're going to solve a problem? What are some approaches that might be taken? A great example of this would be back in the 1960s and 70s when people were talking about solving the problem of poverty. And you can even go back earlier than that. You can go back into the late 1800s, the mid 1800s, the late 1700s, when socialism develops, when capitalism develops, or the theories of capitalism develop. These are theories that are trying to solve the problem of poverty. And who has the authority? They come to different decisions or different conclusions about who has the authority, who are the stakeholders, what solutions are possible. You come up to the 1970s, and by that time, almost every modern democracy has decided that welfare states are the answer. They're the solution to this problem. The government has the ability, they have the authority, they have the power to uh, solve the problem of poverty for people who are poor, for their citizens. Um, there's a variety of different approaches that different welfare states took to the problem of poverty. But in the 1970s, we started actually calling it in the United States the war on poverty. Notice that goes back to the stasis of definition, right? What are we going to call it? We're going to call it a war. How are we going to approach it? How are we going to solve it? Well, we're going to use the welfare state to solve this problem. People who disagree with welfare states often jump back to the facts, the stasis of conjecture, and they will note, well, but we didn't really solve poverty, did we? We've got all of these problems. There are still poor people in England. There are still poor people in France, and we're looking at a state like Greece, that the welfare state has become so bloated that people are having real problems. I mean, their economy is on the verge of collapse thanks to the welfare state, nobody wanting to get rid of it. So if you're going to use the stasis of jurisdiction as your jumping off point, these are some questions you need to ask. You need to figure out your answers to these questions. I want you to note that all of these questions that I'm presenting here, these are not exhaustive questions. These are model questions. So I'm giving you questions to help you develop your own questions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't ask these questions. You absolutely should ask these questions. But don't think that you are limited to asking these questions. Rather, these are the types of questions that you need to ask. And if you're going to develop your own questions, you need to use these as models. But the core question you're asking when you're looking at jurisdiction or policy, what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? Who has the authority to do it? Whose problem it should this be to solve? And who will benefit from this problem being solved? What steps should be taken to solve this problem? What steps are actually possible versus what steps are not possible? And how do we distinguish between them? And then, of course, if you're looking at somebody else's solution or somebody else's argument, these are some questions that you can use to engage in counter argument or just to analyze somebody's argument. If you're seeing somebody else's argument and you want to enter into a conversation with them from the stasis of jurisdiction or policy, here's some questions you can ask. I invite you to freeze or pause the video at this point. Look at some of these questions, read them, write them down, see if any of them are useful for whatever situation you're dealing with. Let's talk about what these stases look like in action. Now, I've already given you a bunch of examples. I want to do something now that's relatively innocuous. This isn't political necessarily. This isn't necessarily moral. This illustrates how stasis theory can be used to just make decisions. So let's say you own a piece of property. You want to plant a tree in your yard. How do you decide what tree you want? How do you decide where you can plant it? How do you make an argument with your significant other or with your homeowners association or with your neighbor about where the tree should go? Stasis theory can help you do that with conjecture, separating fact from speculation, opinion, any of that kind of stuff. You want to ask, what kind of tree is it? What are you planting it for? What's going to be the purpose? Do you want a shade tree, a fruit tree? Do you want to beautify your yard? How much sun does the tree need? Where should it go based on whether or not you want it to shade your house or shade a particular part of your yard? How is this tree going to grow? Is it growing up? Is it the type of tree that grows out? What about its root system? Does its root system go straight down? Does the root system go out? These are some facts you need to know. Think about the rules for the homeowners association that you might live in. or the rules for your neighborhood, or the attitude that your neighbor might have about where it should go. What are the parameters of your yard? Um, are there any is there any plumbing that you need to be aware of? Are there any piping or electrical things under the ground that you need to be aware of? What kind of soil do you have? Notice that all of these, what you're trying to do at this stage is you're trying to gather up facts about the tree and the reality of planting it. How deep does it have to go? You're going to have to buy a backhoe to dig stuff up. What are the facts of the situation? Next, you're going to jump into definition. And notice you'll see here some overlap, because when you're getting into definition, it's not only what type of tree and what you want your tree for. That's the stasis of definition. But the purpose of the tree is going to largely determine what you want out of this. How are you going to define the nature of the problem? Is this a beautifying issue? Is this I want a garden with fruit, I want an orchard type issue? Is this a shading a piece of the yard, or bringing your bills down so you're going to shade the sunniest part of your house? All of these are going to be issues of definition. How are we going to define the problem of planting the tree? Is it a legal issue? That also is going to be, and there are going to be elements of definition in that. When we're talking about the issue of quality, not only are you going to straddle the issue of definition, asking questions like, well, if I plant it close to my house, is it going to improve the quality of my house? If I plant it at the back of my yard, is it going to improve the beauty of my yard? How important is it where you plant it? If you plant it on the line between you and your neighbor's property, how is it going to affect the fence between your properties? Is it going to grow over into your neighbor's yard? And if it's a fruit-bearing tree, or if it's something that when it sheds its leaves, is your neighbor going to appreciate that? Is that something that's important to your neighbor? And then, of course, you have jurisdiction. Do I have authority to plant the tree? Is it legal for me to plant the tree? Am I knowledgeable enough about horticulture to plant the tree on my own, or do I need to hire somebody to help me out? The reason I've used this example of planting a tree is because you can see, this helps you to see, not only is stasis theory a valid way to make decisions in real life, like normal everyday life. We're not just talking about political issues here or moral issues. We're talking about everyday decisions. Stasis theory can help you do that. But this illustration also helps you see how much the stases overlap. So even though it's important to recognize these as categories, the category of fact, the category of definition or the nature of the problem, the category of the quality of the problem, the category of the policy or what you're going to do about the problem, looking at something so mundane as planting a tree really helps you to see how these stases overlap with one another. How you define a problem is going to determine, to some degree or another, the facts of the problem, and the quality of the problem, and what you do about the problem. The facts of the problem are to some degree going to help you figure out how to define the problem, and the quality of the problem, and what you're going to do about the problem. What exactly you want to do about the problem is going to help you determine the importance of the problem or the quality of the problem, what you're going to call the problem, what facts are important to note in this problem. And so these stases, while they are their own categories, all of the stases really do overlap with each other. Even though we create these categories, we human beings create these categories, categorization is a way to approach problems. It's a way to help us navigate the world. all categories, to some degree or another, are fuzzy at the edges. And this causes me to want to reintroduce to you my issues with deconstruction as a methodology, um, as a skeptical methodology towards a kind of intense skepticism towards a knowledge. Because terms and concepts are fuzzy at the edges, that does not necessarily mean that reality itself is fuzzy at the edges. Um, reality is reality. Truth is truth. And while there may be pieces of the truth that bleed into each other, and our ability to define truth or to categorize different pieces of the truth is imprecise, is imperfect, incomplete. We can still be quite precise with our language, and we still need to categorize the world. We need to be able to know what things are and distinguish those things from what they are not. So categories are not a bad thing, but you do need to recognize that all categories, just because of the nature of language and conceptualization and our limitations as human beings, all categories are going to be fuzzy at the edges. That does not necessarily mean that we can't approach truth and we can't describe reality. We can describe reality. Just because terms can be fuzzy at the edges, and just because terms can be deconstructed, just because you can be tricked into thinking, because language is what it is, and because conceptions are what they are, they're fuzzy at the edges. You can be tricked into thinking that reality is just a construct because the words we use to describe reality are constructed and imperfect. Don't fall for that trick, because it is a trick. It's a rhetorical trick. It's the skeptic's trick. You find the fuzziness of the concept and you press, but it's an illusion that tables aren't real, because the word table can, based on how you're using something, the thing that we call a table can also be turned into a bed, or can be turned into a diving board, or be turned into a chair. That doesn't mean that tables don't exist. And this is an example of something called the troll's truism. This is another thing that comes from a guy named Nicholas Shackle. Back in 2005, Nicholas Shackle wrote Vacuity of Postmodernist Methodology. And in this text, he introduces us to several terms. And these are terms that he uses to describe postmodernist methodology of deconstructing reality or deconstructing concepts. He doesn't really just focus on deconstruction, although he does address it. But for him, he defines postmodernism as a kind of hyper-skepticism towards reality. And you can see that right here, that this is what he's talking about, right? So this is how he kind of defines postmodernists. Philosophically, they are united by a skeptical doctrine about rationality, or about reason, that namely that rationality cannot be an objective constraint on us, but is just whatever we make it. So this is his definition of postmodernism, and he addresses the problems of postmodernism by naming certain strategies that he sees postmodernists engaging in. And one of them is called the troll's truism. A troll's truism is a mildly ambiguous statement by which an exciting falsehood may trade on a trivial truth. So what happens is you take an actual truth that's kind of mundane, and you develop a conclusion from that truth that's completely false. It's completely ridiculous. What I just suggested about tables is an example of that. It would be because for example, because I can use a table as a bed, a chair, or a diving board, tables don't actually exist. And can you see the little trick that was played there? So you move from this mundane truth that the thing that we call a table, you can actually use for a variety of purposes. But that then doesn't mean that tables don't exist. And somebody might argue, well, they're not saying that tables don't exist. They're saying that the concept of the table is an imprecise concept. Well, no, it's not. We know exactly what we mean by a table. That is not an imprecise concept. Just because a table can be used for non-table-y things doesn't mean tables don't exist. And it doesn't mean the concept of the table is imprecise. So that's the trick that Shackle's pointing out here. And as you start to think about this, you can see how it develops out into a bunch of other stuff. Anyway, I highly recommend reading this essay. It's a great piece of philosophy. But for our purposes, the reason that I bring it up and why it's important to bring up is because you've now noticed that if you're engaging an argument, you're jumping into an argument using stasis theory, these categories kind of become fuzzy. And you may be tempted to think, well, maybe they're not useful because of their fuzziness. They're fuzzy at the edges. They bleed into each other. That's not accurate. You can jump into an argument by looking at the facts, by looking at the nature of the problem, by looking at the importance or the quality of the problem, and by trying to figure out how to solve the problem and whose job it is to solve the problem. These categories are there to help you think through problems. And without the categories, even though the categories may bleed into each other and overlap slightly and may be fuzzy at the edges, without these categories, it's really difficult to figure out how to invent an argument. Where do I even start? And that's the purpose of the stases. Stasis theory helps you figure out where to start, how to get into the problem. Stasis theory is designed to help you invent a way in to a given argument or a given problem. So over the course of this lecture, I've talked a little bit about counter arguments, right? I've given you several examples of questions that you might ask when you're dealing with somebody else's argument. So if you hear an argument and you're like, nah, I don't buy it. I don't think this is right. I don't agree with this. How can you use the stases of stasis theory as jumping off points to begin countering an argument you disagree with or you find weak in some way? Well, here are some ways to do this. You can challenge the facts. So you can go to the stasis of conjecture and you can say, I'm not sure the facts are right here. I'm going to look at these facts. Or you can go to the stasis of conjecture and you can say, I think you might be leaving stuff out. Okay, so you've chosen to talk about these facts. What are some facts that might call your conclusions into question? You can use the stasis of definition to redefine the problem. Well, so-and-so's calling the problem blah, blah, blah. What if we called it something else, right? You can use the stasis of quality to take into question or problematize the significance or the importance or the sanctity of the issue. I don't think this is as important as you're saying it is, or you're being very dismissive here. I think this problem is way more important than you're suggesting that it is. And then, of course, you can use the stasis of jurisdiction or policy to address the problem of what to do about the problem, what to do about how do we approach this issue? Whose problem is it? Let's go back to the issue of poverty and see how this might work, right? So we have these solutions to poverty. The welfare state is presented as a solution to poverty. in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, conservatives and neoconservatives and libertarians have presented the free market as a solution to poverty. And think about what the counter arguments that they offer to the welfare state are. Neoconservatives, neoliberals, conservatives, libertarians, free marketeers. They would argue, well, the fact is that the welfare state didn't solve poverty. Maybe they might redefine it. They might say something like, well, it made poverty more comfortable, but it didn't actually solve the problem of poverty. And then they might give a bunch of facts to do that. But notice what they're doing is they're redefining the problem. No, this, or they're taking issue with the policy. No, it didn't. The policy didn't do what it intended to do. It actually did something else. Notice that free marketeers might argue that people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Whose job is it to get a person out of poverty? It's the individual's job to get the person out of poverty. Whereas a socialist or somebody who believes in the welfare state, so maybe a progressive, even if they're not necessarily socialists, they believe that we need a welfare state. They might say, no, people can work really hard their whole life and never liberate themselves from poverty. Clearly, that suggests that poverty isn't just the problem of the person in poverty. It's got to be somebody else's problem as well. Maybe it's their neighbor's problem. Maybe it's the government's problem. And usually the people who are supportive of a welfare state will say it's everybody's problem. That's why we turn to the government. So you can see that in both instances, you have these two different competing ideologies that are arguing with each other in developing counter arguments against each other by looking at jurisdiction, jumping off from the stasis of jurisdiction. They might jump off from the stasis of importance. Both of them are going to argue that the economy is really important and that poverty is really a really important thing that we need to deal with. But for a free marketeer, they might say something like, if you are unwilling to work, you don't deserve not to be poor. That might be a quality argument, right? They're leaping off from the stasis of quality or importance. Is this important? Well, a free marketeer might say, well, yeah, it's important, but not as important as you're making it out to be. And they might switch around and say something else is more important, the character of those people or the right for people to keep their private property. Anything that builds its argument based on the victimhood status of some group or some individual, they're always leaping off from the quality stasis. They are saying this is important because, and they use the victimhood as an example of the victimhood of the individual or the particular group that they're advocating for to demonstrate the importance. Somebody could argue, no, those people are not victims. That too is a qualitative approach. But notice that now we're bleeding over into definition. How are we going to define these people? Are we going to define them as victims, or are we going to define them as loafers or lazy or maybe we don't define them as victims or at all, victims of oppression? Maybe we're going to define them as victims of circumstance. We can feel sorry for them. You notice that now we're trying to define what the nature of the problem is, and people who are in support of welfare state define the nature of poverty maybe in different terms than free marketeers will. What we call neoliberals or libertarians or conservatives, economic conservatives. So in both cases, what we're dealing with is people who are engaging in counter argument by using the stases to leap off or to find a way into the argument. They are analyzing the argument of the other person, saying, I don't agree with that argument. And whether they are doing it intentionally or unintentionally, they're using the stases as a way to develop their counter arguments. All right, so everything so far has been about stasis theory. That is one heuristic for inventing arguments. That's one way to find a way in. It's the Roman way. Stasis is Latin. Stases, that's a Latin term. Topic is a Greek term. And the topoi of invention are more ancient than the stases are. So stasis theory comes out of the Roman rhetorical tradition, the Latin rhetorical tradition. The topics come from the Greek rhetorical tradition, going back to the sophists, to Aristotle, the philosophy, the rhetoric of that particular period. So we're looking at 500, 600 BC. In ancient rhetoric, the word topoi also means a place. So notice stasis is a place to stand on. Topoi is a place to find something. And the reason they would call these the places is because literally in the schools, they would have these scrolls. And the teacher would go and they'd take the scroll down and they'd say, okay, so we're going to talk about, I want you to create an argument, or I want you to argue about something using this idea or that idea. And eventually, certain of these places, these topoi, became so common, we ended up calling them in English the commonplaces. These are the common places that you can go to invent an argument. I do want to point out before we move on that the topoi can also be used as strategies of analysis, and they can be used as ways to support arguments that you've already made. So if you're writing an essay and you've got a claim that you're making, and you're wondering, how do I support this claim? How can I develop this claim? You can go to the topoi. And by looking at the topoi will help you come up with ideas for how to support a claim that you're making. So let's look at what they are. The topoi are divided into different categories, just as we saw with the stases. But there's several more categories where the topoi are concerned. Just as we saw it with the stases, in the topoi we have the category of definition or classification or clarification. What you're trying to do with definition is you're trying to categorize things. You're trying to make something that's not clear clearer than it was. And there's basically two approaches to this for the Greeks. You can define something by its kind, right? Or its class. We call that genus. The other way is to divide things. So you can divide things into categories. You can divide things into its parts. That's the topoi of definition. Let's go back to our tree analogy and see how this works with the tree. And then I'll talk about a little bit about poverty as well. So I'm going to use the two examples that I've used the most here to kind of work this out. Notice that when we were back in if you're trying to plant a tree, back when we were talking about planting a tree, one of the things we talked about is what kind of a tree is it? What do we want it to do? This is classification. So you can start by figuring out, well, what type of tree am I wanting? What do I want it for? What's its purpose? That is the topic of kind or class or category. Maybe there are multiple reasons that you want to plant this tree. Maybe it's a fruit tree that gives good shade and beautifies. Maybe it's like a beautiful cherry tree that can get big enough to also shade your yard. Now you've taken the topic of definition or the commonplace of definition, and you're breaking this thing down into its parts, right? Well, if I want it as a shade tree, it should go here, but I have to be careful because it's also a fruiting tree. And so, yeah, it's going to give shade, but it might get messy underneath it. So we want to pay attention to that. If it's a fruit tree, it's going to spread out. So I have to keep in mind where I put it based on how it's going to spread out. Think about how the topic of definition or the commonplace of definition can help you invent an argument about poverty. How are we going to classify? Well, I was already talking about that. We've split things up into people who support welfare states and people who do not support welfare states. But that's kind of a false dichotomy, right? Because there are people who support welfare states who also support free markets. You look at something like a country like Sweden. Sweden has a very, very strong welfare state. But they also have strong free market inclinations. The welfare state is paid for by the free market. You see something very similar in England. Well, the welfare state is paid for by the free market. So how are we defining this? Well, if I'm going to argue from the position of definition, I might find a way in and we're seeing this a lot recently in arguments about the welfare state here in the United States. I might find a way in by saying, look, being pro-welfare state doesn't necessarily mean you're a socialist. There are ways to engage in welfare stateism without them being socialist or communist dictatorships. You can have a free market and a welfare state. However, somebody might argue in response to that, countering that by the idea of, jumping off of the topic or the place of definition, the commonplace, starting with the commonplace of definition. Somebody might say, no, you're splitting hairs, right? A welfare state is a move towards socialism. It's a move towards strengthening the state in such a way that if socialists got in charge, they'd be able to take charge. Note what just happened there. By engaging in definition, I'm actually bleeding over into comparison now, because we're now looking at the possibility of the similarities, rather, between the welfare state and socialism. That leads us into the next category of stasis. The next category of the topics, or the next commonplace, which is comparison. So you can enter into a conversation, or you can begin arguing from definition, but you can also begin an argument by comparison. And there are a handful of ways to do this. Three basic categories within the subcategories within the category of comparison. You can look at similarity, you can look at difference, and you can look at degree. If you're going to argue from similarity, there's basically two ways you do this: by analogy, so this thing is like that thing, or by induction. So inductive reasoning is when you note similarities between instances of a particular thing, and you predict what will happen based on basically what has already happened. Okay, that's inductive reasoning in a nutshell. Then there's difference. You can draw distinctions between things. So you say this thing is not like that thing, or it's these things are different in this way. And then you can contrast things, and contrast is often you're often contrasting. In other words, to make a distinction between two things is to note the differences between two things and to kind of explain them. Um, Whereas to contrast two things is not just to note the differences, but to actually put the differences into almost competition with each other. Okay, so those are two ways to make an argument based on differences. And then there's degrees, and degree is fairly simple: superiority versus inferiority, more versus less. These are value distinctions. The next category is relation. Um, it's important to distinguish relation from difference. Whereas the category of difference is saying this thing is not like that thing, the category of relation is putting them in relationship to one another. How do these things interact with each other? Um, Essentially asking the question, what is the relationship between these two things? And there are a couple of, or a few subcategories. There's cause and effect, correlation versus causation. You need to be able to distinguish between those two, right? So you have cause and effect. This thing caused that thing, or this thing did not cause that thing. But there's a subcategory which is correlation versus causation. This thing may have happened after that thing, but that doesn't mean this thing caused that thing. Famous example of that is the idea that uh, once upon a time, when polio was a real problem, uh, people used to think that polio was caused by swimming in public pools, uh, because you got polio from public pools. People would often get it after swimming in a public pool, but it wasn't the public pool that was the problem. It was the polio virus that was the problem. Um, Another great example is that the relationship between drowning deaths and eating ice cream. Drowning deaths go up in the summer, eating ice cream goes up in the summer, but drowning deaths are not a function of eating ice cream. So that's correlation versus causation. Antecedent and consequent. So whereas cause and effect is this happened and so this happened, right? This caused that thing. Antecedent and consequent is more like, so this thing is going to happen, or this thing has happened, or this is something that is done. What naturally comes from that? Or what might come from that? What are the possible outcomes of doing X thing? So this isn't exactly cause and effect, because cause and effect is often looking backwards. Antecedent and consequence is often looking forward. What happens if we do this? What could happen? What could be the benefits of doing this? Whereas cause and effect is this happened and so that happened. And then there's oppositions. You could put things into relation with one another by showing that they're in opposition to each other. Contraries are uh, things that are opposed to each other. Contradictions are things that cannot coexist, right? One great way to think about this, to think about how these two things are different from what we saw with differences, right? So if we go back to the idea of difference, we have distinctions and contrasts. Well, what's the difference between a difference and a contrary? Why is contrary not under differences, for example? Well, when we're looking at contraries, differences involve unlike or dissimilar things. So they differ in kind, right? Contraries are in opposition to each other. They're incompatible with each other. And so it has to do with how they relate to each other. Two things can be different and not really have a relationship with each other. When you're dealing with contraries and contradictions, you're actually putting these different things in relation to one another. So differences have to do with kind, contraries have to do with relationship. A great example would be the fact that liberty and license are an example of two things that are different. So both of them, we would often refer to liberty and license as two different kinds of freedom, but they're different, right? Liberty requires some element of self-control. License is a complete lack of self-control, but they're not necessarily contrary to each other. The contrary to liberty would be slavery. Those are two contraries. But slavery is not a contradiction to liberty, right? A contradiction would be more like the fact that something cannot simultaneously be what it is and what it is not, right? So the water is hot, the water is cold. That is contrary. But it would be a contradiction to say the water is both hot and cold. That would be a contradiction. Water can't be hot and cold at the same time. It's either going to be hot or it's going to be cold or it's going to be something in between. Next is circumstances. So the next way to enter into a conversation, the next commonplace, category of commonplace, is to begin arguing from circumstance. And there's basically two ways to do this, the possible and the impossible, and the past fact and the future fact. So can it happen? Is it possible for something to happen? Did it happen or will it happen? And then the last one is the commonplace of witnesses. This is very similar to the argument for the stasis of fact. If somebody has an authority to talk on something, right? This is our first subtopic in terms of witnesses or testimony. That's another way to name this particular topic, witness or testimony. You can go to experts who are informed on a particular issue, and you can use that to begin either to begin your argument or to substantiate a claim that you've made. You can look at a testimonial. This is like literal witnesses. You're literally getting people to talk on this particular topic. You can use data, facts, statistics. All of these things count as witnesses when you're trying to substantiate or make an argument. You can use common knowledge or what we would call common sense, shared values. Somebody who is arguing in defense of the welfare state, for example, might argue from the maxim that poverty is the mother of all crime, right? So this is a kind of a little, what we could call it, what the technical term would be an ideograph. It's kind of a distilled form of ideology. But the assumption behind that phrase is that if we can get rid of poverty, we can get rid of crime. Because crime, the only reason people commit crimes is because they're poor. So an argument in defense of welfare state would be if you want a more peaceful community, you get rid of poverty. If you want people to stop being criminals, you get rid of poverty. That's an example of starting an argument from the category or the commonplace of witnesses, using the subcategory of maxims or common sense, shared values. And then, of course, you can use laws. Laws become witnesses. That can count. You can count natural laws. You can count civil laws. These are all witnesses to the truth of a particular proposition. Think about what we talked about earlier with the Second Amendment. Many pro-gun advocates begin their arguments from the Second Amendment because it's a witness. This is just the law. I have a right to own a gun. And if you try to regulate that, you are infringing on my civil rights. And then, of course, the last one is precedents. You're using concrete examples. When we're talking about a precedent, we're talking about things as they already are. Have we seen places, look at the welfare state, for example, have we seen places where crime has gone down thanks to what welfare advocates would consider the eradication of poverty? Do we see a lessening of crime in those places? What are the facts on that? Notice I've gone back to facts. Facts are a particular kind of witness. Notice that with the Greek commonplaces and the Latin or Roman stases, there's a lot of overlap between these two. So these are just two different approaches. These are two different heuristics for inventing arguments. But I don't want you to think that they're incompatible. They're actually quite compatible. The reason that I want to end with the commonplace is because whereas the stases are a great way to engage or to invent an argument, like jump into an argument that you want to get into or jump into a counter argument, and they're more manageable. I think that the commonplaces, the topics of invention, are very useful when you've already got a claim and you want to defend it or develop it in some way. You want to support and develop a particular claim or idea that you already have. But that being said, the commonplaces are also incredibly useful as jumping off points for beginning an argument, coming up with a thesis, coming up with questions, and for engaging in counter argument. What stasis theory does is stasis theory, whereas the topics start with categories, and just tell you to kind of look at these different possibilities, stasis theory actually categorizes questions. And so it's a great place to start, not only because it's more manageable, but because every argument starts with a question or a problem that needs to be solved. Having those questions, knowing the right questions to ask, and using the questions from stasis theory as a jumping off point to developing other questions, that is a great way to come up with a thesis statement, with a research project itself, with an opinion essay and the theme of a particular opinion essay. I find the commonplaces are a great place to go when I need to once I've developed my ideas and I need to be able to defend, or once I've established my ideas, once I know what my position is, which I almost invariably come to through stasis theory. The topics or the commonplaces are great for further developing that, for going into closer detail. That's how I use them. Anyway, I hope you found this to be helpful. These are two fantastic heuristics for developing arguments, for figuring out how to jump into an argument, or for figuring out how to jump into a counter argument. Remember what heuristics are. Heuristics are pragmatic systems or methods for solving problems in the absence of certainty. The purpose of a heuristic is to find a way into an argument so you can develop a good enough solution. Stasis theory and the topics of invention, as you practice these, as you start using these, you will find yourself not only not having problems figuring out what to say, the blank page when you start a project won't be as scary anymore because you have some place to go to start arguing. So I encourage you to use these, whether you are writing argument, whether or not you are doing creative writing, or whether you just want to test somebody else's ideas to see if they are reasonable. The heuristic of stasis theory and the heuristic of the commonplaces are great ways to go about doing that.